Welcome to Books of Our Time, produced by the Massachusetts School of Law and seen nationwide. Today we shall discuss a book about Tom Paine, who in the late 18th century was one of the leading writers of the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the battle against established authoritarian religion. The book is Thomas Paine and the Promise of America, and its author is Professor Harvey Kaye of the University of Wisconsin at Green Bay. Professor Kaye is with me to discuss his work, and I am Lawrence R. Velvel, the Dean of the Massachusetts School of Law. Harvey, thank you for coming.
Oh, thank you so much for having me out here to Massachusetts.
Presumably it's warmer here than there, but who knows? Harvey, why did you write a biography of Paine? What about Paine fascinated you? What caused you to write about him?
Well, I have to say that I was a Paineite even as a boy. My grandfather was extremely fond of Thomas Paine, and he had books by and about him in his home library. My grandfather was a trial lawyer. And whenever I was sort of shooed out of the room, whenever the parents and grandparents were going to talk serious stuff, I would wander the apartment, and I came across these books. And I was absolutely fascinated by them. And I thought, who was this radical? So even as an 8 or 9-year-old, I don't know if I even understood the books, but even as an 8 or 9-year-old, I became fascinated by Thomas Paine. And for my entire life, he remained sort of part of my thinking. And then in the course of the 1980s, once I was into the teaching of history, I had some opportunities to talk about him and eventually to write about him.
Yeah.
So I first, in fact, wrote a young adult biography, and I didn't want to give up that attachment to Paine. So this new book, Thomas Paine and the Promise of America, is biographical and then tells the story of his memory and legacy.
You said to me that when it came to write the book, it didn't turn out to be the book that you had expected to write.
No, not at all. I had expected to write a book of 3 parts. The first part recounting Thomas Paine's life and labors. The second part, the story of the suppression of his memory. And in the third part, assuming it had been suppressed, I intended to bring Thomas Paine back to life.
Right.
I intended to have him speak to America today. And when I began, after I got, or had already had the contract for the book with that proposal, and I went in to do the research, and I did a whole variety of explorations from Thomas Paine's own work all the way to biographies of those people that I thought might have been interested in Paine. What I discovered was that in every generation, Americans, especially progressive Americans, liberals, radicals, and others, had reached back to the Revolution, had recovered Thomas Paine's memory, and drawn on it for inspiration and encouragement as they sought to extend freedom, equality, and democracy. So the book turned into something completely different. I ended up not only telling of Thomas Paine's life and his memory and legacy, I ended up retelling, this is rather immodest, but I ended up retelling American history by way of Paine's presence in American history.
Right, right. You found that Paine had been an inspiration to various kinds of people.
Right.
Explain who some of these groups who some of these groups were, and or what their attitudes were towards things.
Okay. Well, I'll leave behind the question of while he was alive, and
right. We'll come back
talk
to
in the
that.
19th and 20th century.
Yeah.
In the 1820s, 2 groups in particular reclaimed Thomas Paine. One group were free thinkers, those who stood apart from the organized religions of the day, and we can talk about them a bit later. And the other group, and these were associated, the other group were the working men's parties,
right.
The parties of working men that sought to really truly secure the right to vote and also to challenge government to no longer have monopolies that they would grant to wealthier business people. So the working men's parties and the free thinkers together. Then I discovered as well the abolitionists.
Can I interrupt you for just a second?
Yes, sure.
I found out from the book something I had not known, and you might just briefly talk about, that there had actually been unions in the 1820s. I thought unions were a creature of the 1870s and 80s, but they go back long before that.
No, indeed. I mean, many of the unions in some ways had roots in the idea of the guilds of the Middle Ages. These were often skilled artisans and craftsmen, but there were also soon to be women's efforts to organize up here in Massachusetts. No, unionization had begun as a concept really in the 1820s, and there were some examples of it earlier than that. And it was these kinds of men, and perhaps women, but definitely men, who laid claim to Thomas Paine, this working class hero, this partisan in favor of working class rights and equality. And then, as I said, abolitionists, especially the Garrisonians, reached to Thomas Paine because of his writings about equality, his call for an abolition of slavery. Beyond that, the women's suffrage movement, right from the beginning,
right.
where there was a Paineite influence. So in the first half of the 19th century, all of these movements that we now know of as having been so fundamental in making American democracy were all inspired in some ways by Thomas Paine's writings.
Yeah.
In the latter part of the 19th century, we have the populists, especially those Midwestern farmers and Southwestern farmers and workers, the progressives, who surprised me. I didn't realize there was that connection when I came upon it. Socialists, Eugene Debs and others, who I hope we'll get to talk about. The anarchists, the immigrant anarchists, German-American working people, German immigrants and German-American working people. I mean, all the way through American history, I thought at first it might be selected figures. It turned out that every major progressive movement through the 19th century and well into the 20th reached back, grabbed hold of Paine, embraced him, because this was their way of connecting themselves to the American Revolution. This was their way of saying that our struggle is rooted in the American revolutionary heritage. And in essence, this is their way of establishing themselves on the same grounds as the daughters of the American Revolution amongst conservatives and those kinds of folks.
Harvey, this is a question from left field, so if it's too far out, just tell me, forget that, Larry. But I have heard it said that conservatives are people who worship dead liberals. Do you agree with that?
Well, in the case of Thomas Paine, it definitely seems to be true. If you imagine that for this last generation, ever since Reagan, conservatives for the first time in American history have themselves been quoting Thomas Paine, a very narrow conception of Thomas Paine. But yeah, they promote themselves as the heirs of Paine. They also try to lay claim to most of the other founding fathers in a monopolistic way. Ronald Reagan is in many ways the fascinating figure in that when he ran for president in '76 and then in 1980, when he actually got the nomination and then won the presidency, he had shown that he never really gave up his affection for FDR, for Franklin Roosevelt, that had gone back to the 1930s and 40s. So it's a fascinating question. I hadn't thought of it like that. But that's great.
Well, it's often said about economics, worshiping classical Marshallian economics and so on.
Well, actually, if you don't mind my saying, it's interesting. When you walk into an economics course, micro and macroeconomics, they all reach back to Adam Smith. Yeah. I'm sure Adam Smith would be shocked to think that this is what economics has become. Well, similarly, I think it's the case that conservatives want to believe that they're the voice of America. But if you think about it, what America has become has been a consequence of these struggles of liberals and progressives for 200 years. So it's all well and good for conservatives to try and worship that, but they ought to realize they're worshiping, indeed, dead liberals.
Another subject that's a little bit out of left field, but I can't resist. When I was young, I played left field, you see.
I knew you were.
I noticed that early on, and a couple of times now, as so many people do, you use the word progressives.
Right.
People who, and there was a movement in this country known as the progressive movement, and that was back around roughly 1900 or 1890 to 1920, something like that. But in the last 5 to 10 years, liberals have taken to calling themselves progressives again, because the conservative side has succeeded in the last 15 or 20 years in making the word liberal a bad word.
Yeah, I see where you're going. And in fact, when we speak, there's the capital P progressive, which is the 1900 progressives of La Follette and the later Teddy Roosevelt. When we talk about progressives today with a small p, we have in mind, indeed, liberals and radicals in many ways. I mean, we really are talking about the broad left. And the reason I use the term may be slightly different than others. Most people, indeed, are retreating, I think, from the term liberal, which I'm not necessarily retreating from. I see myself as liberal in some ways and radical in others. I use the term progressive because I think it's important for liberals and radicals to be talking to each other once again. I think there's too much of a divide between liberal Democrats, and I'm still a capital D Democrat, and radicals who have positioned themselves with Nader and others around the Greens. And I think we need more of a conversation about this kind of thing.
Thomas Paine was a man, and I'd like you to elaborate on this, who came from the working class and who had a deep belief in the common man. Why don't you elaborate on that?
Yeah, Thomas Paine was born in England. His father was a stay maker, a corset maker, in fact. And Thomas Paine himself, though he had some years...
We don't even have corsets anymore, do we?
No, good question, good question.
I don't remember those for the last 50 years.
At least they don't use the words, right?
Yeah.
Anyhow, so he himself was trained as a corset maker by his father. After having had some years of schooling, he wasn't completely uneducated in the formal sense. But his father was an artisan and a Quaker. And Thomas Paine grew up with an appreciation of what it meant to be an artisan, a skilled worker. And there was no way in which a smart artisan was ever going to believe that he didn't have, as an Englishman, the same rights as anybody else in England. This was very much a part of English artisan life. But it didn't necessarily assume democracy yet. It assumed rights. You know, my home is my castle, a right to speak, and if you can't speak in a formal political sense, then you and others can stand out in the street and raise hell out in the street.
It assumed intelligence?
It assumed intelligence, and it also assumed a certain responsibility of self-education. And this artisan class in England, and as it was also in the United States, well, what would become the United States.
Paul Revere, for example.
Paul Revere and others. These were skilled workers who made it a point not only of knowing their own craft, but of knowing about the world. It's sort of, in some cases, autodidactic, oftentimes collectively gathering together in taverns and other places to learn these things. So Paine grew up with this kind of artisan spirit. It was also the case that he had a very difficult life. Along the way, he suffered poverty, lost his first wife in childbirth. I mean, it was a very, very difficult time. Eventually became a preacher, a teacher, and a number of other jobs that he took on, and then became, even for a while, a tax collector. Mm-hmm. And he spent time in London. First of all, he spent time on board a privateer serving the English crown. And there he learned about the life between the devil and the deep blue sea, but he also learned about seamen and their smarts, their skills, their talents, and their radical fervor, you might almost say. He also spent time in London, and he spent time amongst these radical artisans, these smart, self-educated artisans who really had new ideas about the world. They subscribed to a natural philosophy, Newtonian philosophy, which was not only to speak of science and God's creation as something to be studied scientifically, but also to consider society and politics as requiring scientific study. So Paine was part of this kind of milieu, and that's the milieu in which he meets Benjamin Franklin, which is so important. So he has this sensibility of the radical artisan within him, but he's not a radical yet when he's in England. He's probably what we might think of today as a liberal. He is asking questions. He writes challenging arguments when he's gathering with his friends in taverns.
Can I interrupt you for one second?
Sorry, yeah.
Because I consider this extremely important. Am I correct in saying, and I'd like you to continue, but essentially what I get out of this is that you had a working class that was very, that was educated, even if it was self-education, and even if it was education through lectures and meetings rather than books. Right.
Well, there were two layers to the working class. The artisan class had this kind of educational capacity.
Which today we tend to think of working class people as not being that way. I personally think we think of that wrongly.
Well, actually, we can get to that. The founders themselves, aside from the likes of Paine, looked down their noses at artisans and working people. Our founders were Republicans, anti-monarchy, okay? They wanted to create a new kind of political order. But it was Paine who's going to push the democratic agenda because of his confidence in the common man and woman, in fact. Right. And so when he comes from England to what will become the United States,
because of Franklin?
To America, because of Franklin's encouragement, in late 1774, he brings with him two kinds of sensibilities. On the one hand, this radical artisan sensibility, and he also brings a hatred for inequality and a hatred for royal authority. And why? Because he had been leading an effort on the part of tax collectors, the excise men, to try to gain some kind of salary increase. And in his efforts to gain that salary increase, he got fired. He got sacked, as the English would say. So he ends up without a job. The little shop that he and his second wife had went bankrupt. He and his wife have an amicable separation, and Franklin suggests, come to America. And he arrives in America, and he is overwhelmed by the possibility.
You mean his wife got rid of him because he wasn't making money?
Possibly. Possibly. There's a lot of theories as to what
You mean this is not a new story? Okay.
This is quite possibly. When he comes to America, though, he is absolutely, I mean, think how late this is. He really doesn't, get to walk the streets of Philadelphia until January of 1775, and he is extremely impressed by American possibilities and prospects. This is a wonderful country. He himself secures a job that he probably never even have dreamed of as the editor of a magazine, a brand new magazine, in part because he had Franklin's letter of introduction that helped. Yeah. But it's also the case that he sees around him working men, these artisans, organizing. okay, demanding themselves certain kinds of democratic rights and privilege, democratic understandings. So Paine becomes, at that moment, a Democrat in his thinking. And we can pursue that line if you'd like.
Well, what I'd like to ask you at this point is, his first great work in the United States, and as you point out, these were all written within a year or two of his
Right.
being in America, which is
Yeah.
phenomenal.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which shows how much he brought with him and the contrast between that and what he saw, which inspired him to write what he wrote. But his first great work was Common Sense. What was Common Sense all about? What was its impact on the American public? To what extent was it a bestseller? And what would that mean in today's terms with 300 million people in our
After
population?
Lexington and Concord in April 1775, Paine became all the more committed to the idea that America should become independent. And he ends up leaving his job at the magazine to devote his energies to writing this pamphlet, Common Sense. And in this pamphlet, he is determined to do, he's going to call upon Americans to recognize their own possibilities and to declare their independence. But he does more than that in his mind.
They weren't thinking about independence at
There were
that time,
those who were thinking about it, but no one was really publicly calling for independence. A lot of the founders like to say later, well, we were all calling for independence, but I think they were exaggerating. I think they were embellishing the
How
truth.
about Sam Adams?
Sam Adams may well have had in his mind, he amongst a very few probably had in his mind, but once again, the premier call, that sort of great call for independence, appears in Common Sense. So that is going to be this 46 to 50 page pamphlet, depending on the edition you get, and it's this call for independence. However, this was not simply a call for independence. He doesn't even call for independence until well into the pamphlet. He begins by talking about what people are capable of. And he talks about people gathering under an oak tree in a democratic fashion. And he uses this as a way of attacking monarchy and attacking aristocracy. He's preparing the groundwork not simply for a call for independence. He's going to call upon Americans to create a republic. Now, in fact, not just a republic, he's going to call upon them to create a democratic republic in which it's pretty clear he had in mind farmers and workers being a part of the political nation, not just the big landholders, not just the lawyers, not just those with power, property, and privilege. This is a whole new political order.
Yeah.
So, indeed, the founders, as the ones we think of, Washington, Jefferson, Adams, and many of them, they welcomed this call for independence. There's no question about it. But some of them pulled back and said, yeah, okay, the independence idea is great. What's this about democracy? Paine didn't use the word democracy, but you knew from reading this that democracy was now in the air.
I think at some point you described the situation, don't you, Harvey, as being one in which people who were of the aristocratic class who were reluctant to be in the vanguard of independence or even to be for independence finally had to join. They had to join the bandwagon in order to lead it, or it would have gotten out of their control.
Right. It's possible they had independence in mind, but they weren't sure about independence. Keep in mind, the British Army provided security, originally against the French, against the Native Americans, and decidedly, if there's rebellions from below of slaves, of indentured servants, and maybe even of artisans, you could call on the British Army.
Yeah.
So you hesitate to do these kinds of things.
Yeah.
Paine's pamphlet appears, calls for independence, and it proclaims this independence idea in a way that farmers in Virginia, artisans in Philadelphia and Boston, okay, the artisans in Boston are decidedly aroused already. They didn't need the Philadelphians, but now they join them. They see that independence would not only give them the rights that they're demanding, it would actually give them the power of a democratic sort to govern themselves. So now they begin to call for independence, and in essence, indeed, the elites realize, well, indeed, right now, we better take hold of this movement or we're going to lose control of this movement. This isn't in every case, but this does happen in some places.
I gather from what you were saying, Harvey, that unlike the conventional history that I believe we are taught, the revolution was in large part a revolution from below.
There's it's interesting. There was a Vermont minister, I believe he was from Vermont, not New Hampshire, but a Vermont minister who in the 1790s was writing a history of Vermont. And he talked about the American Revolutionary period, and it was fascinating to me. He put into words what I had been thinking. He said, Thomas Paine, and others like him, but especially Thomas Paine, taught to Americans, educated Americans, with what they taught him. So what it was is that when Thomas Paine came to America, he saw in American life the possibility of this independent Republican democracy. And he turns this into an idea and then shows Americans what they're capable of. So in essence, indeed, there's this dialectic, there's this exchange between the man with the pen and the people of the working classes. And in the course of this exchange, we get this revolution, I believe.
Before we go to break, one last point about this. I think it was Joe Ellis who said in his book, and when he was on our program, that Washington understood that the mercantile system imposed by Britain, which today we would call colonialism.
Right.
I was in New Zealand last year, and they were pointing out that until some rather recent period, every export from New Zealand had gone to Great Britain, gone to the United Kingdom. That was the system. And Washington seemed to understand that, although it was partly due to the avarice of the planters in Virginia, these guys were always in hock under this system. They couldn't get out from under.
Right, absolutely. There was a sort of, there's no doubt that the likes of Washington and Jefferson had motivation that involved more merely than the struggle from below. There was real advantage should they gain their independence. Yeah. Okay, but of course it meant not only transforming a political system, it also meant transforming an economic system.
Yeah.
It meant creating a whole new system. And I just point out that when Washington convened his soldiers here in Massachusetts, his officers here in Massachusetts for dinner, even in the battlefield, as late as the end of 1774 into 1775, he would often toast George III. It really was Paine's pamphlet that led Washington himself to see the possibilities that existed.
Right.
I mean, I may promote Paine in some ways above all the other founders, but I think he deserves it in many ways.
Yeah. We have to take a short break. We'll be right back.
Two words for you. Pop quiz. Ready? Name any funny movie. A drama. Name a mystery. And one more thing. Name the movie your kids saw today in science class.
Know what really matters. Know about your kid's school. And know about your kid. Find out 100 ways to know more, do more.
Go to jail for a gun crime, and your family serves a sentence with you.
Can I ask a few questions about the apartment on Park Street?
What was your name?
My name is Juan Hernandez.
It's been rented.
Hello, my name is Sanjay Kumar. I am calling about the apartment on Park Street.
It just rented.
My name is Tyrone Washington. I'm calling about the apartment for rent on Park Street.
It's not available.
I use a wheelchair and...
It's gone.
Hello, my name is Graham Wellington. I'm calling about the apartment for rent on Park Street. Is that still available?
Yes, it is.
Oh, it is?
Housing discrimination is illegal. If you think you've been a victim, call us.
Welcome back. Harvey, Thomas Paine is perhaps with Abraham Lincoln one of the two greatest political writers in American history. And I think that he, as great as much of his writing was, there was perhaps never anything more beautiful, more inspiring than the beginning of the first paper in the American Crisis Papers series.
Right.
And we're going to put that as the one that said, these are the times that try men's souls and so on. You know,
If I can just mention to you, I met an African-American disc jockey who said to me, I love Thomas Paine. He gave me my opening line, these are the times that men try soul.
One has to restrain oneself from quoting the whole thing. It's so magnificent. It's like the Gettysburg Address.
Oh, yeah.
How did he come to write the American Crisis Papers, and what was the impact of the American Crisis Papers?
Yeah, I mean, Paine had this way with words that was really phenomenal. And after Common Sense had it brought about revolutionary thinking in America. You had asked earlier how many it sold. It sold 150,000 just that very spring before the Declaration of Independence. And in the wake of the Declaration...
Can I 150,000
right.
and a population of 3 million,
so
would be something like 12 or 15 million
yeah,
today.
I think it would be easy to say 15 million, and that probably doesn't count all of the newspapers that excerpted it. And we should not fail to say again that Paine gave all the royalties from that to Washington's army for mittens for the troops. Well, after the Declaration of Independence, Paine was so committed, and keep in mind he's almost 40 years old, he was so committed to the American cause, he actually enlisted in one of the militia forces. I won't go into the full nature of that militia force, but he ends up in Staten Island with Washington's army looking at 30,000 British troops being unloaded in New York City.
Right.
And of course, Washington is compelled to retreat. He's defeated repeatedly in the New York City area, and he and his army, what's left of the army, are retreating across New Jersey.
Right.
Thomas Paine is with that army, and they all know this is Common Sense. That's Thomas Paine's nickname. And Paine is basically encouraged by Nathaniel Greene, a Quaker general, or Washington, or both, to think about taking that pen up again and writing a pamphlet that'll sustain the American cause. Washington himself writes to his I think his brother or cousin, he says, you know, one more blow like that and we're finished, the game is up. So Paine begins to write somewhere around Newark, New Jersey, on a drumhead, as they say, by firelight, a pamphlet that will become the most quoted pamphlet, probably the most quoted line in American history, other than, you know, all men are created equal. And that line is, as you said, these are the times that try men's souls. And so he writes this at a time where the American Revolution is on the verge of collapse as they're retreating to retreat across the Delaware. Paine gets permission, he goes to Philadelphia, gets this pamphlet published. The pamphlet appears, Washington is thrilled. He has his officers read the pamphlet to his men before they return across the Delaware to win the Battle of Trenton. The pamphlet itself gets out into the countryside. Boatmen bring their boats to help transport Washington across the Delaware because they're now re-inspired by this. Militiamen return. Basically, Washington could not have accomplished the Battle of Trenton without that pamphlet because it brought militiamen back and it inspired his troops. And this is the first of a series of pamphlets which come to be known as the Crisis Papers. And whenever the cause needs words, Paine is there calling for people to contribute, to pay taxes, to recruit men and women to the cause in some fashion.
And you say that it was a factor in bringing the boatmen who took Washington's army across the Delaware River to attack Trenton and then Princeton, I believe.
Right, on that Christmas, you know, Christmas Eve, and the Hessians who were stationed.
He couldn't have done it without the boats.
Could
like
not have done it without the boats. And I'll
boats.
just point out that this wasn't my discovery. David Hackett Fisher, in his book on Washington's Crossing, does a really nice job of that.
Harvey, what among the many other things that he said,
this is a revolution that's really going to require a citizen's army and citizen support. John Adams talked about the fact that the revolution was accomplished when you had 1/3 of the people against the revolution, 1/3 could have gone either way, and 1/3 were in favor. And you know, Paine was probably aware of that. And New Jersey itself was filled with Tories in various places. Paine really needed to inspire people to realize that this was a cause worth fighting for and dying for if necessary.
and people had been deserting in droves and going home.
And I do want to say, if you don't mind my interrupting, that you mentioned Abraham Lincoln. I mean, it's come to be appreciated today that Abraham Lincoln probably learned he learned wordsmithing, not from the prairie teacher of yore, of legend, but as his own editor of his writings, his collected writings, Roy Basler explains, probably because he read Thomas Paine. And now a lot of people have not made it, you know, they don't make a lot of that they say, okay, so Lincoln in his early years read Thomas Paine, and for that reason, Lincoln himself was never a Christian. He believed in God at certain points, but he was not a Christian. But I believe that Lincoln read Paine and remembered the political arguments about freedom. And I think you can hear echoes of Thomas Paine all the way through Lincoln's finest speeches.
Yeah, people tend to credit Lincoln's style to reading the Bible and Shakespeare.
Which
but
I think
Paine
is true.
also,
I think that's true. Because Paine, that's right, Paine read both the Bible and Shakespeare. Paine knew the Bible inside and out because of his mother's upbringing.
Yeah. Now, Lincoln and Paine both saw the Declaration of Independence quite differently from the Constitution. One was in 1776, the other was in 1787 and 88. Right. And I must say, in my profession, law, people tend to totally forget the Declaration and the preamble to the Constitution.
Right.
What were the difference how did Paine and Lincoln see each of these?
Well, I mean, for someone like Paine, it's interesting because Paine has always been underestimated as a contributor to the Constitution because, of course, he was in France at the time the Constitution was being drafted, along with Jefferson. But what's interesting is, in common sense, Thomas Paine lays out, actually calls for the Constitution to be drafted. He says, what we need to do is create this union. And a Constitution can do that. He calls for a charter or a Constitution. And he also called for a Bill of Rights to be included in that Constitution. Now, that's Paine's original contribution to the Constitution. The other part of the contribution that he made is that Paine said no Constitution is created by a government. It's created by the people. Out of that Constitution, a government is formed. So for Paine, the Declaration, perhaps even his own writings, were the spirit that should imbue the Constitution with democratic meaning and purpose. Okay. Now, Paine himself, in contrast to some others, really did believe in the necessity of that Constitution. So long as, and this is the third contribution of Paine, and he wrote about this a good decade before the Constitution was drafted, so long as it could be amended. Because he knew you would make, he said, look, Constitution writing will always involve mistakes. But if you have the power of amendment, a popular power of amendment, a democratic power of amendment, then you can make up for those mistakes. And he and Jefferson shared another view which was important. No generation should be absolutely obligated to the contracts of the earlier generation. So in other words, a later generation should be empowered to change those contracts. And so I may not have answered your question, but I really like to emphasize that as much as Paine was not in the country during the drafting of the Constitution, he had this firm belief in the necessity of a Constitution and a strong Constitution. He was not a states' rights advocate, as Jefferson might well have been. Paine believed in a strong central government as long as it was a democratic and Republican central government. And I think that's something that Lincoln, too, absorbed. And Lincoln reaches back to the Declaration for the idea of for the sense of freedom and equality. Yeah. But he would never have otherwise, disavowed the Constitution. Yeah. I think they share that kind of thing.
There are those who think, I happen to be one of them, that the Declaration of Independence was all about equality, and the Constitution was all about saving the rights of property and the leadership of the aristocratic class. And I think that to some extent Lincoln thought that because he always stressed the Declaration of Independence. And I had the impression from your book that Paine thought that. Is that impression wrong?
Well, I don't think Paine was so eager to portray the Constitution as any kind of aristocratic document. I'll tell you why. I think because of the preamble, we the people, and that democratic power of amendment. But this is interesting thought. Okay, Paine's Common Sense was a more radical document than the Declaration in many ways. In Paine's Common Sense, there was an absolute case made against monarchy and aristocracy. In the Declaration of Independence, though it says very powerfully, all men are created equal, it attacks one king, George III. It does not attack monarchy. One could have imagined in the wake, I know this is a real fanciful imagining, but it's conceivable that you could still have had a king and an aristocracy of sorts. And in fact, both Jefferson and Adams had certain inclinations. I mean, Jefferson believed in a kind of meritocracy, as did Adams. Okay, Paine himself never really disavows the idea of meritocracy, but what Paine believes is that the meritocracy should always be subject to this rising from above. Paine really believed that revolutions bring forth the genius of the people, the working people as well. And by the way, Mark Twain in a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court is standing on Thomas Paine's shoulders and talking in the same fashion.
Yeah.
So there's this spirit there.
Just to change the subject, we have about 4 minutes left in this segment, Harvey. Explain Paine's deism and what deism is, and whether anybody else shared that view at the time, and what was Lincoln's view of that?
Well, let's be sure to distinguish between deism and atheism for a start. Teddy Roosevelt stupidly once called Thomas Paine a filthy little atheist, and Paine was neither filthy nor was he little, and he was decidedly not an atheist.
Well, now, a lot of people have over the years said that he was an atheist. They have shared that confusion.
Yes, an atheist presumes a very material view of the world. There is no God.
Yeah.
And deism implies deism is a strong belief in God, God as a creator. And most of the founders, though not all of the founders, but most of the primary founders that we think of were deists, but they were not militant deists. Thomas Paine was a militant deist. Thomas Paine believed that there was a God, the creator. But Thomas Paine said, look, if God, the creator, is so supreme as we say, then surely his creation would have not involved his constant intervention. So he denies the idea of scriptural revelation and an intervening God. In his mind, God is the creator.
To make it comprehensible to somebody like me who knows nothing about religion,
right.
Is it sort of like a guy who starts a company, runs it for a few years, and walks away and let other people run it?
I don't even know if I can answer that. It's a great analogy, but I'm driven by humor right now as opposed to
it's a befuddling analogy. Okay.
I think let's look at it this way. Okay, it's not exactly intelligent design. Okay, it's probably more in the light of God the Creator with evolution as possibilities. Okay. But I think what's essential to understand is that Thomas Paine wrote The Age of Reason, his deist treatise, because he was opposed to atheism, which he found too often the case in France as they attacked the Catholic Church. And he was against, oh, by the way, Thomas Paine was absolutely committed to separation of church and state, and that was in Common Sense, and we can talk about that if you'd like. So he's absolutely committed to separation of church and state and freedom of conscience. But he's also committed to the idea that there is a God, and our commitment to God is to do good, okay, to do good. And if we want to understand God, we should study his creation in a scientific fashion. Now, that distinguished him, of course, from organized religion. Organized religion believed in revelation and in scripture. Paine said there were some good ideas in the Bible, but there were too many bad ideas. And God does not speak to one man alone. God spoke to humanity through the creation. And Paine felt that too often what happens, and he saw it all about him, was that churches were in bed with the ruling classes, the kings and the aristocrats. And he felt a democratic society required the separation of church and state, freedom of conscience, and indeed this possibility of understanding God directly through the creation.
Yeah, was it Marx who said that religion is the opiate of the people?
But Marx did also say it's the heart of a heartless world.
Well,
Sorry.
Interesting. But I take it that in effect Paine was saying something very similar 80 or 90 years before Marx.
I don't think he quite saw it in those terms. I think he was in the political sense, yes.
But I mean, he too thought. See, from your book, I got the impression that a lot of the dispute of the time, and I'm afraid maybe today too, was fought out in religious terms, even though political things were really at stake, and that the organized religion was really, and had been for 1,000 years, part of the political power structure.
Right. And in fact, if I can just segue into the present a moment, when one reads Bush's arguments in favor of the appointment of Harriet Miers to the Supreme Court, one imagines the likes of Thomas Paine, Thomas Jefferson, and the others rolling over and they're just horrified by this argument that here's someone to be appointed because of her commitment to a particular set of religious beliefs. Okay, this is a secular nation, but God is not mentioned in the Constitution. They would be, and indeed in Article 4 is no one should be judged by their religious beliefs for appointment to office. And Paine believed that, as did Marx, who is a later generation, but they were radically different kinds of folk, that there should be this, that indeed politics too often uses religion to control the people.
Yep. And it was because of this confusion, I gather, between Paine's views in atheism, that Paine was reviled for 100 years and not mentioned by the
Right.
respectable
Conservatives
people.
didn't care. Deism and atheism, in their mind, it was a way of going after Democrats, small d radical Democrats. So many people say that it was religion that was held against Thomas Paine. There's no question that's true, but they used religion to go after his politics, okay? Because keep in mind that there were others of the time who were also deists. But it's interesting to consider what really scared them was the fact that working men were beginning to show a great interest in deism, and so too were the students at Harvard and Yale.
Yeah. And while they weren't showing interest in deism, my understanding is that what were at the time the new religions, Baptists, Methodists, that they were much more democratic.
Yes, Congregationalists, let's not forget, controlled government in Massachusetts and Connecticut. And Baptists and Methodists and even Presbyterians, however much they might have been somewhat aligned, these folks were not empowered in the same way the Congregationalists were. They had to pay a special tithe, basically, a tax, to the state church. So as you see Universalists, Unitarians, even the Baptists, the Methodists, and evangelicals emerging, Congregationalists felt under pressure for, separation of church and state. And by using Paine, they were able to say, oh, look at what this kind of religious talk can lead to. So they portrayed him as an atheist.
We have to take another break. We're going to take a short break for another public service announcement. We'll be right back. Stay with us for more from Professor Harvey Kaye on Thomas Paine.
Hey, yo, Tim, get on your job, kid. We got school, yo. I see you in the window, man. You want me to do? I got the bus here, man. I got connections. We holding up traffic. Let's go. I'm not letting you waste your life like that, yeah.
Don't walk. Don't walk. Walk. Do not enter. Hot dogs. Definitely like hot dogs. Motorcycle club. Everything must go. Ghostly ghouls. Don't look at that, Teddy. Body piercing. Ouch.
Everyday moments can become teaching moments because learning starts long before school does. Give your child the start they need at bornlearning.org.
Mrs. Johnson, good to see you again. This is Mike. You can trust him. He looks just like you.
I'll be sucking up to you in order to make you sign the loan.
So, here are your low monthly payments and interest rate as we promised. Here's where they triple. The rest of this is really just here so that we get your house when you can't pay us back.
Such a lovely house.
Predatory lenders are never this easy to spot. Call us and protect yourself with the facts.
Yes, you are. Come here. Let's see how this looks.
Hey, how's my little horse?
She's a lion.
Yes, she is.
You don't have to be perfect to be a perfect parent. When you adopt a child from foster care, just being there makes all the difference.
Welcome back. Harvey, Paine once wrote to George Washington that to have been involved with two revolutions was to have lived to some purpose.
Right.
The other one was the French Revolution. How did he get involved with the French Revolution? Why did he get involved? What did he do?
At the end of the revolution, Paine returned to something that always fascinated him, science and technology. And he had in mind building an iron bridge. And he couldn't raise the capital in America. They just didn't have the resources. And Franklin, who had always been his mentor, said, take your plans and go to London and Paris. Look for endorsements and money there. So in the late 1780s, Paine finds himself back in Europe. And in essence, not that he's not interested in politics, he actually is, but he's not interested in getting involved in stimulating a revolution, at least as he can tell. But the revolution erupts in Paris, okay, the Bastille Day and all of that. And Lafayette, who's one of the leaders of the revolution, invites Thomas Paine to Paris to witness the revolution unfolding. Now, Paine immediately was excited because it meant that no longer would the United States be the only republic in the world, or at least not the only revolutionary republic. Finds himself in Paris, and going back and forth between the two cities, London and Paris, he has had contact with Edmund Burke, who writes, having had a certain sympathy for the American Revolution, writes an attack on the French Revolution entitled Reflections on the Revolution in France. When Paine sees this, he's shocked.
Why did he attack the French Revolution?
Well, he didn't think that anyone should have the right to take off the head of a king. He believed that kings and aristocrats and that kind of social order had developed through the centuries, and Burke believed very much in tradition and in order. And, you know, reforms are okay, but you do it through orderly means and you have a respect for tradition. Right. So he's horrified by the French Revolution. He writes this attack on the French Revolution, and Paine reads this, as did others who responded, but Paine reads this as an attack not only on the French Revolution, but in some ways as an attack on the American Revolution as well. And he takes up his pen and he begins this first pamphlet, Rights of Man. He ends up writing 2 parts of Rights of Man. And in many ways, it echoes common sense. It's an echo of common sense. But it goes beyond common sense, and it becomes an all the more direct attack on the British political and social order and defends the French Revolution. And so Paine becomes a revolutionary outlaw, basically, in England. And in this, he's calling for a revolutionary upheaval in England. He ends up staying on in France.
He was a wanted man. They wanted
he was a wanted
clap
man,
him in irons.
right. He escapes, you know, to Paris. And oddly enough, when he escapes from London to France, when he returns to France to take refuge, he's found out that he has been elected a member of the French National Assembly, because everyone remembers, this is the great Thomas Paine, the American revolutionary, the defender of the French Revolution. Now, what's fascinating about that is Paine didn't speak any French. And so he's made an honorary citizen. He joins the National Assembly, and he is now one of the leading figures in the Assembly, though not viewed as such so much by the French, because Paine, as much as he believed in the revolution, did not, and to put the king on trial, he understood as a necessity, but he actually spoke against the beheading of the king. And it's important to make the point that Thomas Paine absolutely opposed capital punishment. And he said, if instead of killing the king and his family, executing them, let's send them to America. They'll learn how to be Republican Democrats when they get there. So did that get to the question?
Yeah, it did. He just narrowly escaped being guillotined.
Right, because he had opposed executing the king, the extremists, the Jacobins in the French Revolution, had Paine arrested, threw him in jail, and there was a moment during the year he spent in jail where he was actually listed as due to be executed. He was on the death list, you might say, the execution list. And if we have a moment, I'll mention that at this point he was actually rather ill, perhaps almost deathly ill. And his cellmates persuaded the guards to leave open one of the doors to the cell for additional air to come in. They didn't know that Paine was going to be executed the next morning. Other guards come by, marking the doors of those to be executed, and they marked the wrong side of the door. So in fact, the next morning when the door has now been closed, the executioner's men don't see the X, Paine survives. If there's an intervening God, that was the miracle.
Right. God, so much for deism.
Right. And of course, by the end, it takes a few months later, James Monroe is appointed the new ambassador to France from the United States. Monroe secures Thomas Paine's release.
Paine, I think from reading your book, Harvey, was way ahead of himself, hundreds of years ahead of himself on a lot of social changes. Why don't you describe some of the ways in which he was?
Well, I mean, consider the fact, in common sense, for a start, that he had envisioned this American Republic. And he had called for a constitution, and he had called for a Bill of Rights, first and foremost, the protection of freedom of conscience. So here's a man who's a visionary. And in the course of the Crisis Papers, he continues to reveal this political genius. When he's in France, writing Rights of Man, which is this attack on monarchy and aristocracy, he says, look, if we can get rid of monarchy and aristocracy, think of the things we can do, because monarchs and aristocrats are very expensive. And he's imagining how Treasury could be, enriched by the money saved instead of having to maintain these people in their palaces and all of that. So he lays out a set of ideas that we would tend to call a sort of democratic welfare state. This includes setting up job centers for the unemployed, providing, the most powerful idea, of course, was Social Security. He is the first person really to lay out a vision of Social Security. Pensions for the elderly, provisions to make the lives of working people who had no protections at the time all the better. And so in Rights of Man, we begin to get this vision of Social Security, which to this day is recognized as Paine's vision. If you go to the Social Security website, I'm pretty sure it's Thomas Paine who's identified there. Yeah. Then, in a later document that he writes, Agrarian Justice, this is, I think, brilliant. He says, what we need is a system of taxation of the landed wealth. God created the earth for all to share. But those who own property, we shouldn't necessarily dispossess them because they've invested themselves in that. But they have an obligation, they have a responsibility, they have a moral and political obligation to pay taxes on their land and their wealth to those who don't have land and wealth. So he was going to provide for this taxation system of taxing the wealthy to provide a fund. Now the fund is very interesting.
Well, can I just ask you a question before we get into that? Was he in favor of public education?
Oh, yes. He had also proposed the idea of, it's interesting, school vouchers. Conservatives think he's supporting a school voucher idea of today, but what he really had in mind is, since there was no public education, that working people should be given monies to be able to send their kids to schools, because he didn't call for the creation of public schools. He created for the payment to parents so they could send their kids wherever they wanted.
Yeah.
Today, he would firmly have embraced public education. He absolutely believed in education. And indeed, if you think about the system I'm describing in Agrarian Justice, he says, we need to create a fund so that at the age of maturity, 16, 18, 21, whatever it is, every young man and woman should be given an amount of money, a stake in society, to enable them to either get education, buy some land, or set up a small business for themselves. A kind of stakeholder society idea, a democratic one. And he said, if they're rich themselves and they don't want to take the money, that's fine, but they must receive the money and then give it back.
Right.
This has to be equal. This is not a charity. This is not a welfare system. Every young citizen will be given a stake in society, and every elder citizen at reaching the age of 55, thereabouts, should be given a grant of money and a pension. I mean, he had this really magnificent idea of a democratic public, not welfare, but democratic public good kind of system. He believed that a republic should be established for the public good, to benefit not one strata of people, but everyone.
Harvey, let's go through some of the things that he said. We talked about these are the times that try men's souls.
Right.
How about the one, and it'll be on the screen, the cause of America is in a great measure the cause of all mankind. We have it in our power to begin the world over again. The birthday of a new world is at hand.
Right.
When did he say that?
This
Where,
is in
why?
This is in Common Sense. And these are what Thomas Paine believed in America, in American possibilities. But not only for Americans. He believed that the new nation, the United States of America, will be an example to the world. It will set an example to the world that common people can govern themselves, popular sovereignty, that social change and development can be a progressive and democratic kind of thing. It need not necessarily emanate from above and be run by aristocrats and men of power, property, prestige, and privilege. So the cause of America is the cause of all mankind. He believed that America was exceptional because it was going to set an example to the world, but it wasn't exceptional in the sense that others could not equally share in this kind of progressive change.
Or that we would force our views on others.
Right. Thomas Paine would have been Thomas Paine would have supported, if you like, he believed in a United Nations kind of model, and he would have supported the United States supporting democratic struggles overseas. He would not have been a unilateralist.
Right. How about let them call me rebel?
Let them call me rebel, okay? He's sort of saying, stick it to you, Let them call me rebel. He took pride in his rebelliousness, took pride in the American Revolution. And he was never going to allow anyone to say he was a mere moderate.
And he said
in
that.
In fact, if I can just tell you, there's a great line. You know the political line that Barry Goldwater used, extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice?
Yeah.
Well, those are words of Thomas Paine's.
Yeah.
Thomas Paine said, and this is good advice for any parent, moderation in temper is always a virtue. Moderation in principle is a vice.
Yeah. How about this one? My country is the world, to do good is my religion.
Paine believed first and foremost in American possibilities, loved America, always said that. But he saw himself in entering a new age, a world republicanism, you might say. And he felt that our commitments should be more than parochial, more than narrow-minded. Small c, Catholic. Okay.
How about those who expect to reap the blessings of liberty must, like men, undergo the fatigues of supporting it.
Right.
Where was that said, and why?
That's the crisis, I believe.
I think it's one of the crises.
At that moment, what Paine is saying is this. He said, nobody's going to come down and hand you freedom, equality, and democracy. The opportunity is afforded. The struggle demands our action. And you know, when you think about it, there's that famous line, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance.
Yes.
There was the late 19th century progressive, Henry Demarest Lloyd, is that the name, who said, no, the price of liberty is that we must extend liberty. We must not merely hold on to what we have, we must grant an extension of liberty for future generations. And really that's what Paine was about. It's not that you gain your independence and leave it at that. It's that freedom, equality, and democracy needed to be pushed, because Paine would never, ever have sat still with the idea that slavery or any other form of oppression should exist in a
Well, that's
democracy.
pretty much, as I understand it, why you wrote the book, to detail how this has occurred over a couple of centuries.
Right, I want to
now.
remind Americans that the struggle has gone on for more than 200 years. The struggle continues, and if I can just say, I love Paine's line, it is yet too soon to write the history of the revolution.
Paine's line? Was that Paine's line?
That was Paine's line.
Was it? Because didn't Zhou Enlai say the same thing once when asked, what do you think about the impact of the French Revolution? And he said it is too early to tell.
Well, one wonders if all those later revolutionaries didn't grab hold of Thomas Paine.
Yeah.
And I think, let's put it this way, there was a Frenchman who had said the revolution in America was not really a revolution, and Paine said, wait a minute, not only was it a real revolution, as we've never seen before, but history has great things in store for us.
Yeah. Do you think, would you agree, Harvey, that perhaps Common Sense and Uncle Tom's Cabin were the two works that had the most impact of any two works in the history of America?
Quite, it's interesting to say that, because, and I've thought about that a lot, and I mean, one could have to say yes, but you know what? We often forget just how powerful the pen is in American history. Think about the 60s, okay? In the 60s, Ralph Nader and his developing the consumer rights movement off of his pen. I'm just blanking on Rachel Carson, the environmental movement, Michael Harrington, the Other America. And if you think about it, we often think about ourselves as somehow a non-intellectual people, sort of spontaneous, instinctive. But so many of these movements of ours began with some figure sitting down and turning the idea of what America should be into a new kind, articulating it anew. And so we have a history of pamphleteering in America.
One last question. They're telling me to wrap it up, so give this your best 20 seconds.
Okay.
You say, much to the surprise of many of us who were weaned to think that socialism in America owes its origin to Europe, that really it owes its origin to people like Thomas Paine.
Socialism, whatever it really is going to be about, if it ever comes about, and one can't be very optimistic now, is really about democracy. When you get right down to it, the most fundamental struggle is the struggle for democracy. And when you think about it, that's Thomas Paine, that's Thomas Jefferson, and that's Abraham Lincoln, and that's Eugene Debs. I mean, these are American spirits, and it's the American spirit which will make this.
But not like in Lambeau's day. Anyway, thank you for being here to discuss Thomas Paine with us. To the audience, thank you very much, and be with us again next time for the next edition of Books of Our Time.